Hey guys, what if I told you that some of the fiercest pirates in history didn't come from taverns or torture chambers, but from royal palaces and perfumed harems? Women born with silk sheets, not ship decks, who traded tiaras for cutlasses and decided the high seas were a far better inheritance than marriage to some sweaty local prince. These weren't your average pirates, they were heiress pirates of the Indian Ocean, and they turned dowries into danger, lace into legend, and their enemies into cannon fodder. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Once upon a coastline, specifically the 17th century shores of the Indian Ocean, a strange thing was happening. While European navies were busy inventing new and innovative ways to die of scurvy, the waters between East Africa and the Malay archipelago were becoming the chessboard for a different kind of empire. These were not the pirate-infested Caribbean scenes you've seen in every Johnny Depp film. Number this was older, richer, spicier, literally, and somehow much more terrifying. Because on these waters, piracy wasn't just a side hustle, it was a business empire, and some of its sharpest CEOs wore ankle bracelets, scented oils, and occasionally a dagger in their hairpins. Let's start with the basics. The Indian Ocean trade routes were ancient and essential. Long before the British figured out what curry was, there were complex maritime networks moving spices, pearls, textiles, and sometimes people, by consent or otherwise, between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Picture it like Amazon Prime, but instead of warehouses and logistics, you had monsoon winds, slave markets, and the occasional pirate ambush. Now here's the twist. In many of these port cities, especially in places like the Swahili coast, Oman, or the Malabar region, women weren't always locked in basements churning butter or popping out political alliances every 9 months. Some inherited wealth, some owned ships, and some, thanks to a combination of strategic marriages, sudden widowhood, and being extremely done with everyone's nonsense, became pirate leaders. And so begins our tale. Not with a bang, but with a bored heiress. Her name has mostly been lost to history, as these things often are when the men writing the chronicles were too busy clutching their pearls to take proper notes. But we know this much. She was born into privilege somewhere along the coast of Gujarat, possibly the daughter of a wealthy merchant or a minor noble with more silk than sense. Her early life was filled with the usual things: jasmine baths, embroidery, political gossip, and being told daily that her most valuable asset was her uterus. But then two things happened. First, her husband died. Tragic, yes, possibly suspicious, certainly inconvenient. And second, her inheritance came through. And oh, what an inheritance. Ships, spice warehouses, a small army of very confused mercenaries, maybe even a personal astrologer. Whatever the details, this was no helpless widow. This was a woman with a fleet, a motive, and absolutely no patience left. Now, most women in her situation would do this sensible thing: remarry, fade into domestic obscurity, maybe become a legendary cook. She, on the other hand, looked at the shipping routes and thought, what if instead of being robbed by pirates, I just became one? This was not as outlandish as it sounds. The line between merchant and pirate in the Indian Ocean was so thin it may as well have been a rumor. Most trading ships traveled armed. Many local rulers issued privateering licenses, which were basically permission slips to rob your enemies and split the profits. And enforcement? Let's just say the legal system in 1600s, Goa or Muscat, wasn't exactly airtight. So our heiress outfitted her ships, hired a crew, bribed the right officials, and sailed off not toward exile, but into legend. Now here's where the story gets delicious. She didn't plunder random fishing boats or steal from poor traders. No. She went after the big fish. Portuguese galleons loaded with Catholic guilt and questionable diplomacy. East India Company vessels weighed down with textiles and overconfidence. Even rival nobles who thought she'd go quietly. She didn't. She raided spice convoys with military precision. She blockaded ports. She once reportedly sent a ransom note to a Dutch governor with a silk ribbon and a kiss mark on the bottom. Whether that's true or just the fever dream of a very romantic historian is unclear, but it feels right. And her crew, a mix of ex-soldiers, rejected noble sons, a few runaway concubines, and at least one elephant handler. Yes, really. Because when you're building your own pirate army, why not include someone who can manage a siege elephant? But the most brilliant part? She never abandoned her status. She didn't cut her hair or dress like a man. She went full glam. Gold bangles, silk robes, perfume strong enough to give enemy sailors an existential crisis. She wanted the world to know. This wasn't some desperate woman clinging to a rowboat. This was a pirate queen with backup plans and better taste than half the Mughal court. Which brings us to the heart of the matter: survival. You don't last long in piracy without three things: ruthlessness, charisma, and logistics. She had all three. When storms hit, she rerouted her fleet faster than European admirals could find their maps. When rivals tried to assassinate her, she poisoned their wine, then sent their heads back in a decorative basket. When a British captain offered her marriage as a solution, she reportedly laughed so hard she choked on a date. But every empire, no matter how fabulous, eventually gets attention. Soon, the major powers of the Indian Ocean, Portuguese governors, Mughal officials, Omani sultans, began whispering the same question: who is this woman? And more importantly, why is she better at piracy than our own generals? Some wanted her dead, others wanted her in court, preferably in chains. A few wanted her as a business partner. She entertained offers from all sides while quietly expanding her fleet, including one notorious episode where she retired from piracy for 6 months, accepted a land grant, then used that land to build a hidden shipyard. Was she ever truly defeated? That depends who you ask. According to Portuguese records, she was neutralized. According to British sources, she was never captured, but rendered irrelevant. According to local legends, she retired rich, bored, and completely unpunished. Supposedly, she settled inland under an assumed name, raised falcons, and insulted tax collectors for sport. And she wasn't alone. Across the Indian Ocean, there were other women like her, wealthy, strategic, done pretending to be delicate. Some came from Persian merchant dynasties, others from African coastal kingdoms, a few from Southeast Asian royal courts where piracy was considered just another diplomatic option. They weren't always recorded, but they left ripples. Trade routes shifted, forts were built. Treaties were signed not because kings wanted peace, but because they wanted her to stop blocking cinnamon exports. So the next time someone tells you piracy was just rum, parrots, and men yelling about treasure maps, remind them of the Indian Ocean, where heiresses became legends, silk turned to sails, and the most dangerous weapon wasn't a cannon but a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. And that, my friends, is just the beginning. If part 1 taught us anything, it's that the Indian Ocean wasn't just a body of water, it was a runway. A glittering blood-soaked runway where heiresses strutted in silk and strategy, armed with daggers, sea charts, and absolutely no respect for colonial trade policies. But our first pirate queen was far from the only act in this floating rebellion. In part 2, we meet her rivals, allies, and successors, the second generation of dangerous debutantes who didn't wait for permission to rule the waves. And we begin, quite fittingly, with betrayal. Imagine this. You're the daughter of a Persian spice magnate, raised between the scent of saffron and the sound of ambitious men lying through their teeth. You're fluent in Arabic, Persian, Portuguese, and disappointment. You're married off at 15 to some local prince whose most exciting hobby is falconry, and whose most redeeming quality is dying early. Once again, a tragic accident involving poisoned sherbet and a suspiciously relaxed widow. What's a girl to do? Well, if you're Fatima al-Saida, and let's pretend for a moment her name made it into history correctly, you sail east, take half the dowry fleet, and start raiding Portuguese outposts like they're piñatas filled with colonial guilt. Fatima was what we'd now call a branding genius. She understood that piracy wasn't just theft, it was public relations. So she didn't just attack ships, she left calling cards, silk banners with her emblem. Some say it was a tiger biting a rose, others insist it was just her name in gold script. Either way, she wanted people to know exactly who had ruined their day. But Fatima didn't work alone. Her crew was a terrifying symphony of women who were done waiting for justice. Widows of failed sea captains, divorced wives of overconfident merchants, and at least one disgraced midwife who had a peculiar gift for mixing poisons and never smiled. Together, they weren't just pirates, they were a fleet-sized vendetta. Their specialty? Targeting the Portuguese. Because if there's one thing that unites half the Indian Ocean, it's a deep and abiding hatred for Portugal's 16th century imperial ambitions. Fatima knew this, so she leaned into it. She didn't just rob Portuguese ships, she humiliated them, stripping them of cargo, men, and occasionally trousers, before sending them home with a thank you note and a lemon to suck on. And here's the best part. She did it all under the guise of trade protection. She claimed she was merely guarding the interests of coastal women's commerce, which is quite possibly the sassiest euphemism for sea-based looting ever committed to parchment. Now, authorities tried to respond. Sort of. But there was a problem. Fatima wasn't technically breaking any local laws. She had forged alliances with inland nobles, bribed harbor masters, and occasionally staged fake weddings just to secure safe passage. There's one recorded incident where she married a governor's nephew just to get docking rights, then annulled the marriage before dessert. It was performance piracy, legal technicalities held together by jewelry, charm, and sharp steel. But Fatima's reign wasn't all scented letters and diplomatic immunity, because eventually someone always gets nervous when a woman gets too powerful, especially one with her own navy. And so the Dutch got involved. Ah, yes, the Dutch. If the Portuguese were loud, aggressive, and a bit clumsy, the Dutch were quiet, methodical, and soul-numbingly bureaucratic. They weren't impressed by Fatima's silk sails or flaming perfume bombs. They just wanted her gone. So they did what any 17th century European power would do. They launched a civilizing expedition, which is history speak for invasion with extra paperwork. Fatima's ports were blockaded, her ships were harassed, her allies were bought off, and just when it looked like she might actually lose, she disappeared, vanished, ghosted the entire Indian Ocean. No final battle, no dramatic arrest, just silence. Some say she faked her own death and retired in Malacca under an alias. Others say she melted into local nobility, a pirate no more but still feared at every port. And a few romantics insist she became a ghost, still sailing with her crew of angry brides and vengeful midwives, waiting to intercept any ship carrying too much nutmeg and male entitlement. But while Fatima vanished, her impact did not. She left behind chaos, folklore, and an unspoken challenge. If one heiress could outwit empires, why not more? Which brings us to the Comoros. Now, if you haven't heard of the Comoros, congratulations. You're just like 90% of 18th century cartographers. These islands off the East African coast were overlooked, undermapped, and deeply uninterested in European colonization. But they were home to another pirate legend, Queen Maimuna, often known, depending on your source, as the Moon Empress, the Shadow Bride, or simply the one you don't cross unless you're tired of breathing. Maimuna wasn't born rich. She clawed her way up from obscurity, reportedly beginning her career as a trader's assistant and ending it with a throne made of shipwreck wood and enemy jawbones. Charming. What made her different wasn't just her origins, it was her style. She didn't raid on the open seas. She used the islands like traps, luring enemy ships to port with false beacons, then ambushing them with her hybrid army of pirates and local warriors. If the Indian Ocean had a version of guerrilla warfare, she invented it, while wearing ceremonial face paint and leading dances before battle. Yes, really, Maimuna turned piracy into ritual. Attacks were timed with lunar cycles, her sailors performed chants before raids. Even her executions had choreography. Some colonial accounts describe her as a sorceress or demon queen, because apparently if a woman has both a strategic mind and rhythm, she must be supernatural. But despite the drama, her rule was terrifyingly effective. No Dutch, Portuguese, or Arab merchant dared pass the Comoros without paying tribute. Some chose longer routes just to avoid her waters. And like Fatima, she made sure her enemies remembered her, not with silence, but with spectacle. The Europeans tried, of course, to take her down, but island warfare was messy, especially when your opponent knows every reef and is willing to set your ships on fire with jars of fermented coconut oil. Maimuna held them off for over a decade before finally, maybe, being poisoned at a peace banquet, or maybe she retired and passed the crown to her daughter. The records are vague, probably because no one wanted to admit they lost to a woman who painted her battle plans on the hull of her ship in floral patterns. And so the legend grew, By the late 1700s, the Indian Ocean was home to a strange new reality. Female pirates weren't just rare, they were a movement, not organized, not uniform, but undeniably present, and the colonial powers were scrambling. Because how do you fight an enemy who doesn't follow your rules, speaks 5 languages, and smells better than your wife? More heiresses turned captains, more widows chose war over weeping, and the line between pirate, queen, traitor, and ghost grew blurrier by the year. By now, you've probably realized the Indian Ocean wasn't a quiet place for trade and prayer. It was an opera of ambition, betrayal, and high seas havoc, and the lead sopranos were women with ships, grudges, and absolutely no time for European nonsense. But how did they keep their power? How do you maintain a pirate empire when the men with guns and flags keep showing up and asking you to stop being such an inconvenience? Simple diplomacy, deception, and creative wedding planning. Let's begin with Lady Aisha of Malabar. She was born into a royal spice trading dynasty, and her childhood was the usual mix of embroidery, hostage negotiations, and watching uncles mysteriously disappear during dinner. By 16, she'd memorized maritime law, forged 3 sets of trade permits, and started her own small fleet disguised as a merchant escort service, which was technically accurate if you think of escorting as robbing, ransoming, and occasionally setting things on fire. But Aisha was clever. She knew brute force only got you so far, especially when your enemies had more cannons and a mild obsession with monocles. So instead of attacking the French East India Company directly, she started marrying them. Yes, plural. Lady Aisha conducted what one historian generously called a series of strategic unions, and what others might call a polyamorous chess game with battle consequences. Over the course of a decade, she married, not all at once, relax, 3 separate colonial officials. Each of them thought they were the only one. Each of them handed over shipping schedules, fort plans, and confidential letters with the kind of naive trust usually reserved for puppies and doomed lovers in tragic operas. And Aisha? She used the information to build a pirate intelligence network so advanced it made colonial governors paranoid for years. She'd intercept fleets before they left port. She'd rob ships, then send apology letters signed, "Your loving wife." She even faked her own death once just to attend a diplomatic banquet in disguise and poison the wine. Charming. Eventually, of course, the husbands figured it out. The French tried to have her arrested, but the local courts insisted she was a loyal noblewoman of fine character. Possibly because she was bribing them with cinnamon, possibly because she was terrifying. Either way, she was never convicted. She retired to a hilltop estate with her loot, her books, and a rotating cast of bewildered servants who all claimed she gave the best dinner parties and the worst threats. So what does this tell us? That power didn't always look like cannon fire. Sometimes it looked like a wedding veil dipped in rum and gunpowder, but not every heiress pirate played the long con. Some went straight for the throat. Case in point, Yassira bint Harun of Zanzibar. Yassira didn't bother with legal loopholes or social games. She was the daughter of a slave trader turned merchant prince, and she'd grown up watching people be bought and sold like dates in a market stall. She decided very early on that she preferred power with a sharp edge. When her father died, mysteriously, of course, she took over his fleet, tripled its size, and turned it into one of the most feared pirate navies in the region. But here's the twist. She didn't just steal. She liberated. Yes, Yassira specialized in intercepting slave ships, freeing the captives, then offering them a choice: freedom and coin, or a job crewing her ships. Most chose the latter, not because they liked piracy, but because Yassira's ships were, for many, the first place they'd ever seen a woman command respect without being sold for it. Her fleet became known as the Storm of Zanzibar. It flew no flag, answered to no empire, and answered only to her. And if you think that made the Omani sultans nervous, you'd be right. They called her a destabilizing element. Translation: she's ruining our profits and making us look like amateurs. They sent spies. She bribed them. They sent assassins. She fed them false information and sent them back with explosive gifts. Once, she reportedly captured an Omani envoy and released him 2 days later with nothing but a politely worded letter and 1 fewer fingernail. Diplomacy, Yassira style. And then came her boldest move. She declared war on France. Now, declaring war on a European superpower might seem ill-advised, especially when you're a woman leading a pirate fleet out of a coral port. But Yassira was done playing nice. After a French vessel attacked one of her allies and enslaved its passengers, she sent a warning. The French ignored it. Bad choice. Within months, 3 French trading posts were in flames. Merchant ships vanished. A colonial administrator turned up tied to his own anchor, bobbing cheerfully in the surf. The French response was predictable. Outrage, ships, angry letters. Yassira's response? She held a festival. According to rumor, she threw a week-long party to celebrate her victory in maritime ethical correction. It featured fire dancers, roast goat, and a pirate choir singing what was reportedly a very rude song about European hygiene. Eventually, of course, the pressure mounted. The French offered a pardon. Yassira declined. The Sultan of Oman threatened sanctions. She laughed. The British tried to mediate. She robbed them. So how did it end? It didn't. Yassira was never captured, never killed. Her name vanishes from official records sometime around 1794, leading many to believe she either faked her death or retired inland under a different name. Some legends claim she died at sea, sword in hand. Others insist she married a local chief and kept raiding French ships for fun on weekends. What's certain is this: she left chaos in her wake, and inspiration. Because Yassira proved something crucial. Piracy wasn't just for profit. It could be rebellion. It could be justice. It could be the only option left for women who had been denied every other path. And that brings us to the real terror for colonial empires. Not the guns, not the gold, but the idea that piracy could be political. By the end of the 18th century, whispers about these women were spreading, not just among sailors, but among the colonized. Did you hear about the heiress who fights France? The widow who robs the Dutch? The bride who rules the sea? These weren't just stories, they were recruitment campaigns. Young women in coastal towns started disappearing, not into brothels or bad marriages, but onto ships. Trade guilds began reporting a concerning number of female applicants. Port authorities grew nervous. Governors called for tighter laws. One British report warned of an increase in feminine agitation across the ports of the East. Translation: the girls were getting ideas, and they were, because history, as much as it tries to forget these women, can't quite erase their ripple effect. Their names may be lost, their ships may be rotted, but their defiance lingered, like salt in the air, like a curse in the bloodline of every empire that tried to silence them. By the time the 19th century limped onto the deck, the world was changing fast, and not in a way that favored pirate heiresses. The British were snuffing out competition like a paranoid candle merchant. The Dutch had swapped spice for spreadsheets. And the French? They were still mad about being humiliated by a woman with a dagger and a better exit strategy. But the legends hadn't died. Not really. You see, while the empires grew more powerful, they also grew more frightened. Because deep down, they knew the stories mattered. The tale of a noblewoman who burned ships in her wedding dress? That stuck. The midwife who turned admiral? Memorable. And the heiress who faked 3 marriages and still made it to retirement? Iconic. So the powers that be did what scared bureaucrats always do. They rewrote the history books. In official records, the heiress pirates were either erased completely or repackaged as folk heroines, bandits, or, my personal favorite, overly spirited women. Their motives were softened, their strategies ignored, their naval genius labeled luck. Aisha became a mysterious widow of uncertain morals. Yassira turned into a coastal nuisance neutralized by naval superiority. Queen Maimuna, rebranded as a cautionary tale about the dangers of female hysteria and excessive moon worship. How convenient. Meanwhile, male pirates, many of whom had lasted 5 minutes at sea and died with their own swords stuck in their knees, were getting ballads, tavern songs, and action figures. Blackbeard was a legend. Anne Bonny was a footnote. The women of the Indian Ocean? Historical static. But some stories refused to go quietly. In Zanzibar, older women whispered tales of Yassira at market stalls, about how she never bled during battle, how she sank a French frigate with a glare, how her ships were crewed by freed women who could outdrink any man and shoot between waves. In the Comoros, sailors carved moons onto their blades for luck. They didn't say Maimuna's name, but they didn't dock near her island either, just in case. And in Goa, old maps were passed hand to hand, marked with strange emblems, roses, tigers, initials no official logbook ever recorded. Because legends like these, they survive in margins, in rumors, in the soft, salty places empire forgets to control. But here's the real absurdity. These women weren't anomalies, they were consequences. They rose from systems that denied them property, rights, protection, and identity. From societies that told them their value was in silence and obedience. And when those systems failed, spectacularly, they didn't collapse. They sailed. Piracy was never just about gold. It was about agency, about claiming a name when none was offered, about turning the tools of empire, ships, maps, trade routes, into weapons of resistance. And yes, that sounds grand, but it was also filthy, miserable, hungry work. These women lived with scurvy, betrayal, endless seasickness, and the constant threat of being hanged if anyone figured out their secret. Many never made it past 25. Some died in storms, some from disease, some stabbed in the back by the same men who toasted their victories. There were no pensions, no monuments, just sea graves and silence. But maybe that's what makes their survival, of story, if not body, even more impressive. Because centuries later, we're still telling their tales. Not because the records are generous, they're not. Most of what we know about these women comes from court rumors, ship manifests, and angry letters written by men who were extremely annoyed they got bested by someone in earrings. We piece their lives together from fragments, like historians dumpster diving behind a very dramatic opera house. We fill in the gaps with educated guessworks, folklore, and sarcasm, and yet they live, louder than ever. In a world that still underestimates women, what's more dangerous than remembering the ones who refuse to ask permission? Their legacy isn't just cannon fire and corsets, it's the knowledge that even at the height of empire, in a world built by men for men, some women seized power with nothing but a ship and a refusal to shut up. They weren't perfect, they were murderers, smugglers, thieves, but they were also strategists, leaders, and survivors. They broke laws that didn't recognize their humanity, and in doing so, reminded the world that oppression is always a risk when you push people too far, even heiresses. And what happened after their time? Well, colonial governments eventually cracked down hard. Ports were militarized, shipbuilding was regulated, women were pushed further out of maritime trades, their access to ships and crews reduced to zero unless they had a beard or a bribe. The golden age of heiress piracy ended, not with a bang, but with a red tape noose and a bureaucratic shrug. The oceans were civilized, the stories faded, until now. Because maybe what we need isn't another tale of a sad emperor or a pompous admiral. Maybe what we need, especially now, is the story of women who fought, bled, and dared in a world that never made room for them. Women who didn't wait to be remembered. They made damn sure they couldn't be forgotten. So here's to the heiress pirates of the Indian Ocean, to the ones who disappeared into legend and the ones who never got a name, to the queens of chaos, the merchants of mayhem, and the dagger-wielding brides of monsoon season. They didn't just defy history, they laughed at it. And if that's not worth staying up late to hear, I don't know what is. Imagine a world where the deadliest kitchen ingredient wasn't undercooked chicken, but the soup on purpose. Where women stuck in terrible marriages with no way out turned to poison not just as revenge, but as a science experiment. And where authorities, instead of stopping them, said, let's test that. Let's talk about what happens when patriarchy meets poison, and women say, you know what? If the legal system won't free me, the pantry will. Welcome to Europe. It's the 1600s. The food is bland, the plumbing is non-existent, and your marriage isn't exactly romantic. Maybe your husband is a drunk, maybe he's abusive, maybe he thinks deodorant is witchcraft. Either way, you can't get a divorce. You can't own property. You can, however, spend a lot of time in the kitchen with access to herbs, mushrooms, and a rich oral tradition of remedies, and their slightly darker cousins. And that's where things start simmering. Let's begin in Italy, because of course we are. Specifically, Rome, mid-17th century, where an unassuming woman named Giulia Tofana decided she was done watching women suffer in silence. So she brewed a solution. Literally, it was called Aqua Tofana, and it was beautiful. Clear, tasteless, odorless, it could be mixed into soup, tea, even holy water, and it worked slowly over several doses, causing symptoms that mimicked natural illness, Vomiting, fatigue, fever, the usual 1600 stuff. Nobody would question it until it was too late. Now, this wasn't sold on the corner like garlic. No, Aqua Tofana was exclusive, discreet. It was whispered from one miserable woman to another like a tragic love song. Need to be a widow but don't want to be burned at the stake? Julia had your back. Over 2 decades, Julia and her network, yes, she had a network, allegedly helped over 600 women exit their unhappy marriages. Efficient, empowering, morally horrifying. But here's where it gets more historically unhinged. Julia's poison wasn't just popular. It was institutionalized, sold under the guise of cosmetics, specifically as a face cream or manna of St. Nicholas of Bari. Because in a world where a woman couldn't file a complaint, she could still buy a holy branded serum for glowing skin and tragic widowhood. It was, in its own twisted way, feminist chemistry. Of course, all murderous utopias must end. The whole thing unraveled in 1659 when a client, new to the poison game, got cold feet mid-murder and confessed to a priest. The priest, like any man faced with a woman making her own choices, immediately reported her. The woman was arrested, tortured, and under duress. She sang like a canary, with receipts. Julia Tofana was hunted down, dragged from a church where she'd claimed sanctuary, tortured until her teeth rattled, and then executed. Reports differ. Some say she was hanged, others say she was strangled. A few claim she was thrown in a dungeon and left to rot. Either way, the message was clear. You can't science your way out of a marriage. Except, you could. For decades, hundreds of times. Because Julia didn't invent poison. She just made it prettier. And once she was gone, others picked up the bottle. Let's jump to France, late 1600s. It's the reign of Louis XIV, a man so into wigs, velvet, and control, he made Versailles a golden prison for the nobility. Enter the affair of the poisons, part murder mystery, part chemical arms race, and part absolutely bonkers soap opera. It started with rumors, nobles dying mysteriously, heirs keeling over between courses, and whispered names, fortune tellers, alchemists, midwives, all with strange powders and little black books full of very rich, very anxious clients. Then came the arrests. One name, Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, was the Julia Tofana of Paris, only more extravagant. She didn't just sell poison, she offered spiritual services, black masses, aphrodisiacs, and prophecies. Her client list? Nobles, aristocrats, mistresses of the king himself. Yes, even Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's favorite mistress, may have visited her, possibly to poison other mistresses. Because if there's one thing more dangerous than a bored nobleman, it's a bored noblewoman with access to mercury and motive. Soon, hundreds were arrested, tortured, executed. One priest was burned alive. Another woman was sentenced to be flayed. Yes, flayed in public. La Voisin herself was burned at the stake in 1680, refusing to confess to the end. Classic diva move. The king panicked, shut the whole thing down. Trials sealed, records destroyed. Why? Because once the arrests started climbing the royal staircase, Louis realized something. Too many women knew too much. So what was the affair of the poisons, really? A crime wave? A witch hunt? Or an entire generation of women weaponizing their intellect in a world that told them their only value was producing heirs and not embarrassing their husbands? Because that's the absurd truth at the heart of all this. Poison wasn't just murder, it was rebellion, and not always subtle. Let's now visit Germany, where a woman named Anna Zwanziger took things to a new level. In the early 1800s, yes, this continued well into the modern age, Anna used arsenic to poison not her husband, but her employers. Housekeepers were vulnerable, poor, disposable. Anna? She got jobs, slipped arsenic into tea, then nursed her victims as they died. Sometimes she even got hired by the next widow, only to start the cycle again. She didn't just poison for revenge, she poisoned for employment stability. And when she was finally caught, she admitted it all with unnerving calm, claiming she had to do it. It was the only way to remain useful. A woman of her class had no power otherwise. So yes, Anna was a serial killer, but she was also a woman in a world so rigid, her only perceived value came from orchestrating tragedies she could later clean up. Welcome to historical horror, where the killers weren't always mad, and the victims weren't always innocent. And the science? Oh, the science was flourishing, because behind all these murders was a growing fascination with toxins, arsenic, belladonna, antimony, strychnine. Doctors studied it, scientists categorized it, and somewhere along the line, governments started asking a deeply unsettling question. What if we tested poison? On purpose. You'd think, after centuries of women quietly murdering their way out of bad marriages, someone might ask, should we maybe look into poison a bit more seriously? But 18th century governments were, as always, both late and overly enthusiastic, which brings us to the next phase of this deeply deranged historical journey. Poison trials. Not the courtroom kind, the laboratory kind. That's right. There came a time when scientists, doctors, and occasionally full-on monarchs decided poison wasn't just a tool for desperate housewives. It was a fascinating field of medical inquiry. And what better way to learn than to use human test subjects? And not just any subjects, prisoners. Let's talk about the Kingdom of Naples in the mid-1700s, where science was making major strides in anatomy, dissection, and apparently, murder as research. A doctor named Giuseppe Torti believed the best way to understand the human body was to poison it with precision. So he, along with several court physicians, began administering carefully measured doses of toxins to condemned prisoners: arsenic, hemlock, wolfsbane, the usual garden variety death. Their reasoning? These people were going to die anyway, so why not make their deaths educational? The prisoners were told that if they agreed to participate, their sentences might be commuted. A lie, obviously. But this was the 1700s. Honesty was optional, especially if you had a powdered wig and a scalpel. So the prisoners were poisoned, slowly, observed like rats in a maze. Symptoms were charted, doses adjusted. One man reportedly lived 6 days on a cocktail of belladonna and vinegar, during which he hallucinated, screamed about snakes in his veins, and finally dropped dead mid-hiccup. Doctors clapped. Science progressed. Let's be very clear, this was not fringe behavior. This was respected, even encouraged by authorities, because it provided data. And data, in a world just starting to flirt with Enlightenment rationality, was sacred, even if it came from the mouths of dying criminals foaming black bile. But things got really theatrical in Prussia, where King Frederick the Great took a peculiar interest in poisons, probably because he was surrounded by family members, constantly plotting to stab each other with monogrammed forks. Frederick ordered a series of toxin experiments on condemned prisoners to determine the best humane way to execute people. Ironic, yes, but let's not expect too much coherence from the man who also wrote flute sonatas and threatened to annex Austria in the same week. The Prussian doctors set up elaborate trials, different poisons, different dosages, various meals to mask the taste. One unlucky man was fed a series of poisoned sausages while a clerk took notes on how long it took him to collapse. Spoiler, not long. The conclusion? Arsenic was too slow and messy, belladonna too unpredictable, and cyanide, well, it wasn't widespread yet, but once it arrived, boy would they be excited. Now let's detour to Russia, because of course Russia has a starring role in any historical narrative that combines poison and moral ambiguity. Enter Catherine the Great's court. Opulent, paranoid, and constantly on the brink of political implosion. Here, poisons weren't just tested, they were crafted. Russia had entire secret laboratories devoted to toxin production. They were charmingly called the Camera, or the poison rooms. Inside, chemists brewed concoctions for use on spies, enemies, and problematic family members. And yes, these poisons were field tested, sometimes on prisoners, sometimes on Catherine's own court members when she was feeling spicy. If you were unlucky enough to be in her orbit and unpopular, there was a non-zero chance your wine would taste slightly of almonds and revolution. The poison labs were shrouded in secrecy, but what little we know tells us this. They weren't just trying to kill, they were trying to make death look natural. Stroke, fever, sudden heart failure. Because murder is rude, but murder with plausible deniability? That's diplomacy. And here's the real horror. As the science of poisons grew more refined, so did the gendered assumptions around who used them. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, poison had become seen as a woman's weapon. Quiet, domestic, cowardly according to many male writers, which is rich, considering how many governments were literally putting it in prisoners' porridge. But this stereotype stuck. Women were accused of using poison because they were too weak to use knives or guns. They weren't brave enough to confront, so instead they stirred a little powdered death into soup and pretended not to notice when the man next to them started convulsing. It was condescending, of course, but it was also dangerous, because it led to a surge in witchcraft trials, especially in rural areas. Women who knew too much about herbs, witches, midwives with unusual brews, poisoners, old widows with too many cats and not enough husbands, burned them just in case. So now, we had a world where poison was everywhere, on the shelves of scientists, in the mugs of husbands, and in the minds of increasingly paranoid lawmakers. Which brings us to the toxicology boom. By the early 1800s, poison had finally made its way into the hands of detectives. Enter Mathieu Orfila, a Spanish-born French chemist known as the father of modern toxicology. Orfila revolutionized forensic science by developing ways to detect poisons in corpses. Before him, a dead man was just dead. After him, a dead man was a mystery with a chemical fingerprint. Orfila tested poisons on animals, wrote extensive manuals, and served as an expert witness in high-profile trials, including those where women were accused of poisoning their husbands. The irony? The more science proved women had poisoned people, the more society said, "See? Told you women were dangerous." And the cycle continued, because poison, by now, had become a cultural symbol. In literature, in theater, in tabloid newspapers, the deadly woman with the sweet smile, the fatal tea, the powdered inheritance solution. It wasn't just history, it was branding. By the mid-1800s, Western Europe had fully transitioned from poisoning as private revenge to poisoning as public spectacle. The crime had become fashionable. Tabloids were drooling, scientists were clapping, judges were sweating, and women? Well, women were now assumed guilty by default, because if the 17th century whispered she might be a witch, then the 19th century roared, she definitely poisoned her husband and probably his horse. Let's start in England, land of fog, tea, and wildly inconsistent justice. In 1849, a woman named Sarah Chesham was accused of poisoning multiple people in the quiet village of Clavering. Her nickname? Sally Arsenic. Subtle. Sarah was a poor, illiterate wife with too many dead people around her and too many empty bottles of fly poison under the floorboards. Circumstantial? Yes. Convenient? Also yes. She was charged, acquitted, charged again, and finally convicted of attempted murder. Not actual murder, mind you, because the court couldn't quite prove anyone had died from her little chemical experiments. But that didn't stop the newspapers from declaring her the Queen of Death. She was hanged in 1851, while the press printed headlines like Domestic Demon and The Modern Medea, because nothing sells better than tragedy in a bonnet, but this was far from an isolated case. In France, Marie Lafarge was accused of killing her husband Charles with arsenic in 1840, shortly after their deeply underwhelming marriage. She insisted it was for rats. He, inconveniently, died. The trial was a mess. Handwriting analysis, forged letters, disputed autopsies, but the public didn't care. Marie was elegant, well-read, and, most damning of all, composed. Her calm demeanor in court was interpreted not as dignity, but as proof she had the heart of a snake. She was convicted and imprisoned. Her memoirs, written in prison, became a bestseller, because nothing sells quite like a murderess who knows Latin. This growing obsession with female poisoners had consequences. First, it birthed a wave of moral panic. Arsenic was cheap, legal, and everywhere. You could buy it at your local apothecary, often labeled as rat killer, complexion powder, or fancy white sugar that might destroy your liver. No ID required, no questions asked. Women had access, women had motive. Therefore, every woman with a bottle of anything was a suspect. This paranoia reached its absurd peak in Austria-Hungary, where in the 1920s, police uncovered the so-called angel makers of Nagirev. It started with a suspicious pattern in a rural village. Lots of men were dying, quietly, no struggles, no screams, just peaceful exits from terrible marriages. The culprit? A local midwife named Zuzana Fazekas, who, along with a group of women, had reportedly been supplying arsenic to unhappy wives for years. The poison was made by boiling flypaper, elegant in its simplicity, horrific in its implications. By the time authorities caught on, it was estimated that up to 140 people had been murdered, mostly husbands, with the occasional mother-in-law thrown in for flavor. The press had a meltdown. Suddenly, midwives were murderers, herbalists were assassins, old women with strong tea, obvious sociopaths. And while some of the angel makers were hanged, others served short sentences or simply disappeared back into society. The village, when questioned, basically shrugged and said, "Look, we asked for help. No one came, so we handled it." Dark? Yes, but also brutally honest about how isolated rural women, trapped in violent households with no recourse, turned to poison not for power, but for survival. Of course, male authorities didn't see it that way. They saw a conspiracy, an attack on the moral foundation of society. Because if women could murder quietly from within the home, what wasn't sacred? The home had always been the male fantasy fortress. Orderly, submissive, clean. Poison exposed the rot in the walls. It proved that control was an illusion, and that even the most docile wife could become a biochemical threat with a little education and a tea strainer. So what did the system do? It cracked down on knowledge. Herbalists were banned. Midwives were monitored. Entire classes of women were criminalized not for killing, but for knowing how. Medical books were rewritten. Apothecaries restricted female access. Courts began seeing knowledge of plants as suspicious. A woman who knew the difference between digitalis and belladonna, clearly a murderer. And so the dark age of poison panic began, where women weren't just accused of murder, but of knowing too much science. Which brings us to the real absurdity. In all this frenzy, no one ever stopped to ask why so many women felt they had no choice but to turn to poison in the first place. It wasn't because they were all sociopaths. It wasn't because they hated men by default. It was because they had no exit, no legal protections, no police willing to intervene in domestic abuse, no financial independence, no divorce courts that took their side. So they adapted. They turned kitchens into labs, tea into strategy, and helplessness into slow chemical resistance. It was murder, yes, but it was also a twisted form of autonomy. As the 20th century marched in with all the grace of a factory chimney collapsing into a river, the great age of domestic poisoning finally began to flicker out. But not because the world had suddenly become more just, or because unhappy marriages vanished, or even because poison stopped working. No, it ended because society got better at controlling women, and worse at noticing how deeply broken things still were. Let's start with science. As toxicology advanced, poisons lost their secrecy. Detectives had tests, doctors had microscopes, forensics could now identify arsenic in a bone buried 10 years ago and distinguish it from the 12 other poisons in your average Victorian pantry. Murderers who once skated by on plausible stomach cramps now found themselves face to face with spectral analysis and lab coats. The silent weapon had become traceable. This had two effects: fewer poisonings and more creative methods of survival. Women, now aware that slipping a toxic almond into the soup was no longer a guaranteed get-out-of-marriage-free card, had to find other ways out, sometimes through courts, sometimes through activism, sometimes through vodka. The trial was a mess: handwriting analysis, forged letters, disputed autopsies, but the public didn't care. Marie was elegant, well-read, and, most damning of all, composed. Her calm demeanor in court was interpreted not as dignity, but as proof she had the heart of a snake. She was convicted and imprisoned. Her memoirs, written in prison, became a bestseller, because nothing sells quite like a murderess who knows Latin. This growing obsession with female poisoners had consequences. First, it birthed a wave of moral panic. Arsenic was cheap, legal, and everywhere. You could buy it at your local apothecary, often labeled as rat killer, complexion powder, or fancy white sugar that might destroy your liver. No ID required, no questions asked. Women had access, women had motive. Therefore, every woman with a bottle of anything was a suspect. This paranoia reached its absurd peak in Austria-Hungary, where in the 1920s, police uncovered the so-called angel makers of Nagarev. It started with a suspicious pattern in a rural village. Lots of men were dying, quietly, no struggles, no screams, just peaceful exits from terrible marriages. The culprit? A local midwife named Zuzana Fazekas, who, along with a group of women, had reportedly been supplying arsenic to unhappy wives for years. The poison was made by boiling flypaper, elegant in its simplicity, horrific in its implications. By the time authorities caught on, it was estimated that up to 140 people had been murdered, mostly husbands, with the occasional mother-in-law thrown in for flavor. The press had a meltdown. Suddenly, midwives were murderers, herbalists were assassins, old women with strong tea, obvious sociopaths. And while some of the angel makers were hanged, others served short sentences or simply disappeared back into society. The village, when questioned, basically shrugged and said, "Look, we asked for help. No one came, so we handled it." Dark? Yes, but also brutally honest about how isolated rural women, trapped in violent households with no recourse, turned to poison not for power, but for survival. Of course, male authorities didn't see it that way. They saw a conspiracy, an attack on the moral foundation of society. Because if women could murder quietly from within the home, what wasn't sacred? The home had always been the male fantasy fortress. Orderly, submissive, clean. Poison exposed the rot in the walls. It proved that control was an illusion, and that even the most docile wife could become a biochemical threat with a little education and a tea strainer. So what did the system do? It cracked down on knowledge. Herbalists were banned. Midwives were monitored. Entire classes of women were criminalized not for killing, but for knowing how. Medical books were rewritten. Apothecaries restricted female access. Courts began seeing knowledge of plants as suspicious. A woman who knew the difference between digitalis and belladonna, clearly a murderer. And so the dark age of poison panic began, where women weren't just accused of murder, but of knowing too much science. Which brings us to the real absurdity. In all this frenzy, no one ever stopped to ask why so many women felt they had no choice but to turn to poison in the first place. It wasn't because they were all sociopaths. It wasn't because they hated men by default. It was because they had no exit, no legal protections, no police willing to intervene in domestic abuse, no financial independence, no divorce courts that took their side. So they adapted. They turned kitchens into labs, tea into strategy, and helplessness into slow, chemical resistance. It was murder, yes, but it was also a twisted form of autonomy. As the 20th century marched in with all the grace of a factory chimney collapsing into a river, the great age of domestic poisoning finally began to flicker out. But not because the world had suddenly become more just, or because unhappy marriages vanished, or even because poison stopped working. No, it ended because society got better at controlling women, and worse at noticing how deeply broken things still were. Let's start with science. As toxicology advanced, poisons lost their secrecy. Detectives had tests, doctors had microscopes. Forensics could now identify arsenic in a bone buried 10 years ago and distinguish it from the 12 other poisons in your average Victorian pantry. Murderers who once skated by on plausible stomach cramps now found themselves face to face with spectral analysis and lab coats. The silent weapon had become traceable. This had two effects: fewer poisonings and more creative methods of survival. Women, now aware that slipping a toxic almond into the soup was no longer a guaranteed get-out-of-marriage-free card, had to find other ways out, sometimes through courts, sometimes through activism, sometimes through vodka. In country after country, laws began tightening access to substances. Arsenic, regulated; cyanide, restricted. Even cough syrup became suspicious. The rise of pharmaceutical monopolies also meant fewer women were mixing remedies at home, meaning fewer accidental or intentional murders, but also less domestic power. Midwives were phased out in favor of real doctors. Herbalists were dismissed as folklore grandmas, and with them went centuries of knowledge, some dangerous, some deeply necessary. And yet, the poisoner didn't disappear entirely. She just changed outfits. Let's take a look at Nanny Doss, the grinning killer from mid-century America, nicknamed the Giggling Granny. Nanny looked like your average pie-baking, sweet-talking Southern housewife, except she was also quietly murdering her way through a string of husbands with rat poison and cherry pie. She killed 4 husbands, 2 children, her mother, her sister, and a few in-laws for good measure, allegedly because they were boring, abusive, or snored too loud. She was finally caught in 1954 after her 5th husband, who had wisely insisted on an autopsy, turned up dead with a stomach full of poison and disappointment. When questioned, Nanny laughed, literally. She giggled through the confessions, through the mugshots, through the trial. The press ate it up, a killer in a housecoat, a grandmother with a vendetta. But if Nanny's story horrifies you, look deeper. She was a product of decades of repression, abuse, and a society that gave women little but aprons and expectations. Her murders were monstrous, but her motives were woven from the same cloth as every poisoned husband before her. By the mid-20th century, the public stopped seeing poisoners as threats and started seeing them as entertainment. They became pulp novel fodder, TV tropes, Halloween costumes. The Black Widow became a meme before memes existed. Mysterious, seductive, dangerous. A stock character, not a real woman. And in that transformation, the real stories, the pain, the helplessness, the desperate choices, were lost. Because the history of poison isn't just about death, it's about agency in a world that denied it. For centuries, women were told their place was in the home, so they made the home powerful and terrifying. They were told they couldn't wield weapons, so they wielded chemistry. They were told silence was virtue, so they whispered secrets, passed flasks, and learned to stir not just soup, but resistance. And yes, it was dark, it was brutal, it was wrong, but it was also a kind of rebellion in an era that gave them no right to say no. Today we like to think we've evolved, that poison trials belong to the past, but look closer and you'll still find echoes. Women denied agency, abuse swept under the rug, systems that protect the status quo more than they protect the suffering. Maybe no one's stirring arsenic into stew anymore, but the same rage, the same desperation, the same pressure to smile while drowning, still here. So what do we do with this history? We remember it, not as sensational scandal, but as a symptom of how deeply unjust a world can become when half the population is denied autonomy for long enough that murder seems like logic. And we also remember the forgotten ones, the women who didn't kill but still suffered, the women who were accused wrongly, the ones whose names were never printed in newspapers, the midwives who were erased, the servants who vanished, the wives who died quietly, unpoisoned but just as broken. Their silence matters just as much as the loud, scandalous trials. Because in the end, the poison trials weren't about the chemicals, they were about control. And now that we have the history in full view, absurd, horrifying, ironic, and tragic, we can finally say it clearly. The real poison was never in the tea. It was in the system that made the tea the only way out. Sleep well.
Imagine waking up one day in the 15th century, your castle under siege, your husband conveniently dead or missing, and the entire kingdom expecting you to faint. Instead, you grab a sword, strap on some armor, and tell your ladies-in-waiting to load the catapults. Welcome to the gloriously inconvenient world of Europe's noblewomen turned generals, where battlefield orders were barked between embroidery sessions, and diplomacy often smelled like burning siege ladders. If you've ever believed the tired historical myth that women weren't part of warfare, let alone commanded armies, prepare to be politely laughed off the drawbridge. The truth is, Europe was repeatedly saved, defended, or aggressively conquered by women in silk gowns and steel breastplates. But you won't find their stories celebrated in dusty textbooks. Why? Because it's hard for fragile masculinity to survive the idea that some duchess outflanked a horde of mercenaries using her dowry ledger and a well-placed moat. Let's start with the flaming tapestry of chaos that was Matilda of Tuscany, aka Matilda of Canossa. Born in 1046 in northern Italy, Matilda was the daughter of power, bred for obedience, and destined, according to medieval expectations, to marry a man, bear heirs, and quietly die of pneumonia. Matilda had other plans. By the age of 19, she had inherited a massive territory stretching from Lombardy to Lazio, which basically meant she owned half of Italy and all of the headaches that came with it. At a time when women couldn't legally command armies, she was commanding them anyway, and doing it better than the mustached generals who kept losing to the Holy Roman Emperor by walking into obvious ambushes. And if that weren't enough, Matilda had the sheer audacity to choose sides in one of the greatest power struggles of medieval Europe, the investiture controversy, a bureaucratic slap fight between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV over who got to appoint bishops and wear fancier hats. Guess who backed the Pope? Matilda. Guess who raised an army against the Emperor? Also Matilda. Guess who was so good at battle that Henry IV had to sneak barefoot through the snow in 1077 to beg forgiveness at Matilda's family castle? Still Matilda. This moment, known as the Walk to Canossa, became a symbol of papal power, but no one ever tells you that the woman who held the castle doors shut had 1,500 knights at her back and a face that said, "You can freeze out there, Henry." She led campaigns, laid sieges, and once personally led troops into battle at the age of 60. Matilda didn't just outlive her enemies, she humiliated them. But because she had the gall to be a woman in chain mail, her story was trimmed down to pious supporter of the church. Spoiler: the church needed her more than she needed them. And speaking of inconvenient heroines with armies, let's talk about Joanna of Flanders, Duchess of Brittany, who in 1341 refused to be anyone's tragic widow. When her husband, Duke John of Montfort, was thrown in prison by the French crown for having the wrong surname at the wrong time, Joanna didn't mourn, she mobilized. With her infant son in one arm and a broadsword in the other, metaphorically, but also, possibly, literally, she rallied the townspeople of Hennebont, fortified the castle, and told the besieging army to kindly go pound sand. When it became clear the siege wouldn't lift itself, she put on armor, mounted a horse, and led a cavalry raid out of the city gates, setting the enemy's supply lines on fire. A medieval noblewoman burning enemy tents while wearing a surcoat and probably muttering Breton curse words was so outrageous that chroniclers didn't know what to do with her. Some claimed she was possessed. Others said she was just brave. Most were baffled. But the result? She bought time. Reinforcements arrived. Her side didn't fall. And her son would later be crowned duke. Joanna was eventually forced into exile, not because she lost, but because she embarrassed the French too much. And even then, she kept plotting from England, possibly while knitting. But she wasn't the only Joanna making men sweat. Enter Joanna II of Naples, who ruled in the early 1400s and proved that you could be a queen, a military commander, and an absolute scandal all in one lifetime. Her rule was pure chaos, poisoned lovers, rotating husbands, papal wars, and back-to-back sieges. Joanna switched political alliances like outfits, and while not always morally upright, she made one thing clear: she wasn't going to be anyone's puppet. When mercenaries threatened her throne, she simply hired better mercenaries. When the Pope sent an army to depose her, she seduced one of his commanders. Did it work? Absolutely. Did people talk? Endlessly. Did she care? Not in the slightest. And if you're thinking, okay, but these are exceptions, not the rule, think again. Isabella of Castile, before she became a unifying figure for Spain and sponsor of a certain Christopher Columbus, yes, we know, was already showing signs of being the most militarily competent monarch of her age. During the Reconquista, she didn't just fund campaigns, she rode with the army, oversaw battle strategies, and managed logistics like a proto-CEO of destruction. She also wore armor under her royal robes, which is maybe the most poetic metaphor for smile sweetly while preparing for war, in all of history. And unlike many of her male counterparts, Isabella didn't see military service as beneath her. She saw it as necessary. Her involvement at the siege of Baza in 1489 was more than symbolic. She kept morale up, managed the war treasury, and stayed in the field despite illness. It worked. The city fell. The enemy surrendered. And somewhere, an army commander cried into his codpiece because he'd just been outgeneraled by a queen with a crown full of jewels and zero patience for incompetence. But you won't see statues of these women in most European capitals. You won't find them on the currency. You might get a footnote in a textbook, maybe a dusty oil painting in a gallery where the plaque says, "Supporter of her husband's legacy," instead of "Ruthless commander who oversaw the deaths of 12,000 enemies before lunch." And why? Because for centuries, the narrative was tightly controlled. Women could be saints. They could be martyrs. Maybe even queens. But generals? Leaders of men? That was bad for morale, apparently. So their military feats were softened, erased, or turned into legends so absurdly romanticized they might as well have been singing to birds while gutting a siege commander. But make no mistake, they were real. Let's begin with a noblewoman who didn't just challenge kings, she outlasted them. Margaret of Anjou, the terrifyingly competent queen consort of Henry VI of England, gets tossed around in Shakespeare's plays like a romantic subplot in Armor. But real-life Margaret was less, tragic heroine, and more. War boss with a grudge. In the 1450s, during the Wars of the Roses, which was basically the medieval version of a corporate merger fight with swords, Margaret emerged as the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause. Why? Because her husband, King Henry, had a recurring habit of mentally checking out for months at a time. He'd just stare at walls while England collapsed around him. So Margaret did what any queen would do in a power vacuum. She raised an army. She didn't just command from behind a curtain. She negotiated with barons, moved troops, personally oversaw battle plans, and ordered the execution of Yorkist nobles like she was clearing her inbox. At the Battle of Wakefield, her forces defeated Richard of York, and rumor has it she allowed the severed heads of her enemies to be decorated with paper crowns. Political theater? Yes. Mildly psychotic? Also yes. Effective? Extremely. Margaret spent nearly 2 decades waging war, exiling rivals, rallying support in France, and dragging her increasingly fragile husband like emotional luggage from battlefield to battlefield. Her story ended in exile, but not before she proved, again, that royal women weren't just consorts. They were commanders. And in Margaret's case, occasionally terrifying ones. And if you thought English women were the only ones holding war councils in their drawing rooms, let's pivot to Eastern Europe, where the noble ladies came dressed in velvet and ambition. Meet Sibylla of Armenia, who in the 13th century inherited a chaotic kingdom wedged between Mongol invasions, internal betrayal, and European apathy. As queen regent, Sibylla had to deal with an aristocracy that kept trying to sell her out to rival factions and a population that mostly wanted to survive long enough to harvest their wheat. So she made alliances, bribed mercenaries, and cleverly used religion to justify military spending. In short, she turned piety into PR, and kept the kingdom functioning while every neighboring ruler either died or defected. She was never called a general, of course. That would have been unseemly. But she commanded troops through proxies, managed strategy, and held her kingdom longer than most male rulers. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, women were slipping into power not by sword, but by charter. Take Elizabeth of Gorlitz, a duchess who ruled Luxembourg in the early 1400s and spent most of her reign playing politics like a three-dimensional chessboard made of grudges. While male dukes warred over land, Elizabeth quietly negotiated treaties, funded military efforts, and occasionally loaned out her army like it was a pony rental. When rival families tried to oust her, she didn't panic. She outmaneuvered them legally and militarily. Eventually, she sold her rights to Philip the Good of Burgundy, not because she lost, but because she chose to cash out before the real estate market tanked. Capitalism, baby. And then there's Gutta of Denmark, one of the many noblewomen who, after being widowed, was left with a title, an estate, and a bunch of unpaid mercenaries. Instead of remarrying, Gutta paid the mercenaries, kept the title, and ran the show herself. For decades. Her name shows up in military payrolls, land grants, and at least one dispute where she told a bishop to go self-flagellate somewhere else. Most of these women didn't call themselves generals. They didn't need to. Their power was proven every time a war was won without them ever setting foot in the mud. But some noblewomen? Oh, they went full military. Let me introduce you to the unstoppable Caterina Sforza of Renaissance Italy. Caterina didn't just rule a fortress, she practically became one. When her husband was assassinated in 1488, Caterina didn't faint. She stormed the castle gates, took over the town of Forli, and held it against papal troops. Her enemies captured her children, thinking this would force her surrender. Her response? She climbed the ramparts, lifted her skirts, and reportedly shouted that she had the means to make more children. She wasn't bluffing. She later remarried, had more kids, and continued waging war. She commanded forces, withstood multiple sieges, and when the Pope excommunicated her, she fortified her walls and dared him to come himself. Eventually she was captured, because Italy loves tragedy, but even then, she refused to apologize. Her military record was better than most male condottieri of her time. Yet history remembers her mostly for the skirt moment. Classic. And if Caterina was the Renaissance's firebrand, Renée of France, Duchess of Ferrara, was its quieter strategist. Renée didn't lead armies personally, but she funded them, organized militias, and smuggled Protestant refugees across borders while hosting war councils disguised as banquets. She kept her castle neutral, her alliances flexible, and her enemies guessing. In the end, she did more to protect her people than the generals who wore plumed helmets and couldn't read a map. Now, let's take a breath. Because by this point, you might be thinking, why don't we hear these stories more often? Simple. History books were written by men. And men, especially the ones who spent decades stabbing each other for 5 square meters of land, really didn't want to admit that a woman in pearls just outfoxed them with a letter and 3 barrels of salted pork. So instead, chroniclers softened the facts. They said things like, she assisted her husband, or she maintained morale at the castle, or she was present at the siege, as though she were waving a handkerchief and not ordering cannon fire. This wasn't just erasure. It was systematic discrediting. Because if people started believing women could command armies, what next? Land ownership? Voting? Wearing pants? Dangerous ideas. And yet, even the most determined historians couldn't erase everything. The letters survived. The financial records. The mercenary contracts signed with dainty seals and terrifying clauses. Because these women weren't fantasies. They were real, flawed, brilliant, brutal human beings who stepped into power because no one else would, or because they damn well wanted to. Let's begin this round of historical absurdity with one of the most metal sentences in medieval records. The Duchess locked the city gates, climbed the battlements, and ordered the boiling oil. Yes, we're talking about Jeanne de Penthièvre, a noblewoman of Brittany who wasn't content being sidelined in dynastic wars. In the 14th century, when her right to inherit the duchy was challenged by a distant male cousin, because of course, Jeanne did what any reasonable woman would do, she raised an army. She and her husband, Charles of Blois, fought the Montfort family for decades in what became known as the Breton War of Succession, a family feud so long and bloody it made the Hatfields and McCoys look like passive-aggressive tea drinkers. But make no mistake, Jeanne wasn't just sitting at a sewing circle. She co-led campaigns, fortified cities, and personally coordinated military logistics. When Charles was captured and later killed, everyone assumed Jeanne would surrender. She didn't. Instead, she tightened her grip. She negotiated truces when it suited her, broke them when they didn't, and held parts of Brittany for years. All while being painted as a grieving widow. Grieving? Maybe. Dangerous? Definitely. And while we're on the subject of women who made generals cry into their codpieces, let's raise a goblet to Charlotte of Savoy. Now, Charlotte wasn't the most famous queen of France, but during the mid-1400s, she quietly controlled court politics, brokered alliances, and most importantly, directed military resources behind the scenes. She understood 2 critical truths about medieval politics. Armies march on coin. Coin marches faster when women control the treasury. Charlotte funded military expeditions, secretly backed loyal commanders, and ran royal logistics like a kingdom-wide Excel spreadsheet. When her husband, King Louis XI, had mental breakdowns about conspiracies and taxes, Charlotte stayed cool and funded the soldiers anyway. You don't need to wave a sword to wage war. Sometimes, a well-timed purse string is mightier than the blade. Of course, not all noblewomen operated quietly. Some went full berserker. Enter Marguerite de Valois, sister to King Charles IX and unofficial chaos agent of the French Wars of Religion. Marguerite wasn't just a court beauty or political pawn. She was a walking powder keg with access to armies, secrets, and an absolutely bulletproof social network. During the Huguenot-Catholic conflicts, she smuggled messages across enemy lines, hid Protestant nobles in her personal chambers, and repeatedly defied her own family's brutal policies. She helped run safe houses, plotted escapes, and once slapped a duke during negotiations because he insulted her choice of allies. She may not have led troops in formation, but make no mistake, her rebellion was organized, strategic, and absolutely terrifying to the men in charge. And that's really the theme here. Every time a woman challenged the military order, the system reacted not with logic, but with panic. Take Barbara von Cilly, the 15th century Hungarian queen who dared to wield independent power. She owned estates, castles, and her own military forces. That last part was the problem. The Hungarian nobility couldn't stand it. They didn't say, "She leads armies." They said, "She dabbles in sorcery." Because clearly, if a woman beats you at politics and warfare, she must have made a pact with Satan. Barbara's reputation was systematically shredded by historians, clerics, and court gossips, all desperate to turn her into a cautionary tale. And yet, her letters remain, detailing troop deployments, castle improvements, and diplomatic maneuvers. She wasn't a sorceress. She was a CEO with a castle moat. And when we cross into the Baltic, things get even weirder. Sophia of Lithuania, Grand Duchess of Moscow in the late 14th century, married into Russian nobility, and then basically ran the place. While her husband Vasily looked noble in portraits, Sophia was the one coordinating troop movements, negotiating with Tatar forces, and organizing the defense of Moscow itself during invasions. When the city faced destruction, Sophia gathered the court, fortified the Kremlin, and made sure grain supplies wouldn't run out. Her military strategies weren't glamorous, but they worked. She held the capital together while men argued in council chambers and scribes practiced calligraphy. And speaking of scribes, they often left these women out on purpose. Because it's one thing for a woman to command a siege from within a fortress. It's another thing when she founds a secret militia. That brings us to Countess Erzsébet Bathory. Yes, the infamous Blood Countess. Most people know the myths. That she bathed in virgin blood, had a murder dungeon, and invented the Gothic horror aesthetic 300 years early. But here's what we don't talk about. Erzsébet was one of the richest women in Europe. She commanded thousands of troops during border skirmishes, and for over a decade she held control of dozens of fortified castles. When her husband died in 1604, she became the sole ruler of their estates, managing armies, defending her lands against the Ottomans, and negotiating treaties, until, suspiciously, the male nobles around her decided she had too much power. Was she a murderer? Maybe. Was she framed to take her lands? Almost definitely. Because nothing terrified early modern Europe more than a woman with troops, money, and no husband. So they called her a witch. And when they wanted to destroy her, they didn't wage war, they sent priests. Even her trial was a military operation. Witnesses were bribed, evidence was forged, and in the end, Erzsébet was locked in a tower for life, without a single day in court. Because sometimes, the real crime was competence. And that's the through line of all these stories. Women who did what needed doing, while men rewrote the narrative to make themselves feel better. But before we wrap this up and sharpen our sarcasm for the finale, let's raise a toast, or at least a historically inaccurate goblet, to one more icon. Ulrika Eleonora of Sweden, queen regnant in the early 18th century, who decided, after years of being treated like royal furniture, that she was going to rule alone. She took the throne, controlled military spending, reformed the army, and personally oversaw Sweden's transition away from autocracy. She didn't need a sword. She had policy. And in the end, she gave up power voluntarily, making her one of the rare rulers in history to do so without being murdered, exiled, or declared insane. Let's start with a question that's both infuriating and strangely familiar. Where did they all go? The noblewomen who commanded troops, managed supply chains, wrote strategy, and occasionally slapped dukes across a battlefield, they vanished. Or rather, they were vanished, scrubbed from chronicles, pushed to footnotes, and replaced with phrases like, "The king's female companion, present but unremarkable." And this wasn't an accident. You see, once the dust settled after centuries of warfare, after swords were sheathed, kings were buried, and borders were redrawn, the victors got busy writing history. And when men write history, especially in powdered wigs, they often develop a sudden case of amnesia regarding women who told them what to do. The result? Generations of students thought that Europe's women just sat in towers embroidering while the real action happened outside. Meanwhile, the siege led by Lady X, the rebellion organized by Duchess Y, or the military supply depot founded by Queen Z got rebranded as female influence, or moral support, as if logistics weren't the bones of every war ever fought. Even chroniclers who liked powerful women struggled with what to call them. Was she a warrior? That sounded unladylike. A leader? Too threatening. Better to say she was advising her husband, or urging caution, even if what she actually did was tell a regiment to burn the enemy's granaries and take their goats. Take Isabella of France, the woman who overthrew a king and launched an invasion of England in 1326. The official story calls it her husband's deposition. The reality? Isabella organized mercenaries, crossed the Channel with an army, and marched on London. They nicknamed her the She-Wolf of France, which, while badass, was code for "We're terrified and don't know how to process this." And she's not alone. Agnes Randolph, known as Black Agnes of Dunbar, defended her castle against the 1338 siege by the Earl of Salisbury. For months she taunted him from the walls, personally directed counterattacks, and even had her maids dust off the ramparts after bombardments, just to humiliate the English. When asked to surrender, she reportedly laughed and said, "Of Scotland's king I haud my house, he pays me meat and fee, and I will keep my good old house, while my house will keep me." Translation: come and get it, loser. She won. The siege failed. The Earl left in disgrace. And yet, she's barely a footnote in most textbooks. Because women who won on their own terms didn't fit the comforting narrative. Either they had to be monstrous, witches, sirens, poisoners, or invisible. A victorious woman in battle? That's too messy. Even worse, many noblewomen were remembered only for what they wore. You'll find pages in history books describing how a duchess's gown shimmered in candlelight, but not a word about how she used coded embroidery to send battle plans, or how her dress had pockets full of letters to foreign allies, or how her walking in the garden was actually a clandestine meeting with rebel generals. Fashion wasn't the point. Power was. And sometimes the gown was just the camouflage. The problem is that the archival trail goes cold. Not because these women vanished, but because we stopped looking. Thousands of documents were written by and about noblewomen in command, letters to captains, payments to blacksmiths, contracts with mercenaries, instructions for fortresses. But historians, until recently, mostly filed those under domestic affairs. You know, like, please ensure the well is defended, the northern wall reinforced, and the enemy commander assassinated during dinner. Totally domestic. And don't even get us started on marriage alliances, a euphemism for geopolitics with veils and emotional trauma. Noblewomen didn't just marry for love, or ever. They negotiated peace treaties with uterus clauses. If I marry your cousin, you stop raiding my province. If not, my troops will greet your castle with trebuchets and passive aggression. And when these arrangements went south, some women ripped up the treaties and took command. Now, to be fair, there were some men who recorded the truth, scribes who noted that Lady So-and-so raised a company of horsemen, or defended a bridge, or successfully executed a flanking maneuver during a siege. But those sources were often buried in obscure archives, untranslated, or politely ignored by scholars more interested in kings shouting at each other over maps. Only in recent decades have historians started dusting off the reality that noblewomen didn't just survive Europe's chaos, they directed it. And here's the kicker. Many of these women didn't consider themselves exceptional. They acted out of duty, desperation, revenge, or sheer fury that nobody else was doing the job right. In some cases, they led because all the men were dead. In others, they led because the men were incompetent. And occasionally, they led because they damn well wanted to. Which brings us to the ultimate irony. While kings were being poisoned by their advisors, dukes were being stabbed in dark hallways, and knights were dying over the spelling of a treaty, noblewomen were still there, holding the walls, keeping the cities alive, running the armies that actually made the politics matter. They weren't background characters. They were the reason the story didn't end in total disaster. So what's the legacy? It's not statues. You'll find very few bronze monuments of duchesses with swords. It's not schoolbooks. Those still prefer Henrys and Charleses. And it's certainly not TV dramas, which usually relegate these women to smirking seductresses or tragic wives. The legacy is this: they existed, in numbers far greater than we've been told. And their power was real, even if it was written out of the final draft. But now we know better. And with every rediscovered document, every unearthed letter, and every castle account ledger with a woman's name scrawled next to munition purchase, the story changes. No, it expands. Because Europe's noblewomen weren't just in dresses, they were in charge. And now, finally, history is remembering that. So next time you read about a siege, or a treaty, or a quiet castle on a hill, don't just look for the king. Check for the duchess with a dagger in her boot. She's probably the one who won. Tonight's story slices through the muscle-bound myths of ancient Rome to reveal something rarely shown in textbooks: women in the arena. That's right, female gladiators. They were real, they were dangerous, and history mostly shoved them under the sand. So if you thought only sweaty men in leather skirts were doing the stabbing, think again. Let's begin with a fact so absurd it's practically Roman. In a civilization that believed public crucifixion was entertainment, female gladiators still somehow scandalized people. That's how you know it was juicy. In the grand, blood-soaked theaters of the empire, Colosseum, Capua, Pompeii, where men hacked each other to death for applause and honor, women weren't exactly encouraged to join in. But that didn't mean they didn't. They were called gladiatrices, and yes, that's a real Latin word, not some HBO invention. And while they were far fewer than their male counterparts, when they did appear in the arena, crowds lost their collective toga-draped minds. Because in Rome, where gender roles were stricter than a toga at a feast, a woman with a sword was more terrifying than a barbarian invasion. So who were these women? They weren't always slaves. Some were, of course, captured in war, sold into the arena like cattle with better abs. But others chose this life. Yes, you heard right. Just like some men volunteered for the fame, the cash, and the potential to become a crowd favorite with their own action figurine carved in marble, so too did some women. Why would a Roman woman choose to be a gladiator? Let's be blunt, the option sucked. If you were born poor, marriage was essentially legalized labor. If you were rich, you were basically a houseplant with anxiety. And if you had any inclination toward, say, stabbing people instead of embroidering birds, the arena called. The historian Suetonius mentions Emperor Domitian holding late-night shows where women and dwarfs fought by torchlight. This wasn't just sport, it was an imperial flex, like saying, "Look what I can make humans do for giggles." Tacitus, that famously snarky Roman chronicler, absolutely hated the idea. He huffed that respectable women were fighting in the arena, clutching his scrolls like pearls. To him, it was a sign Rome was rotting from the inside. Honestly, if your empire can't handle women in armor, maybe it deserves to rot. Let's pause here and get something straight. The Romans weren't squeamish about violence. They crucified thousands of slaves after the Spartacus rebellion and left their corpses to hang as road decorations. They drowned prisoners during mock sea battles just for fun. So why did female gladiators shock them? Because it blurred the lines. Roman identity was built on control. Men ruled, women obeyed, blood belonged to men's sport. So when women entered that space, sword swinging, it sent the entire system into an existential tailspin. Now, let's talk about what the gladiatrices actually did in the arena. They weren't flower-tossing halftime shows. These women fought in real, often deadly combat. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii hints at women fighters being paired for dramatic effect. Amazon versus Achillea, for instance, two gladiatrices whose names appeared in a fresco, locked in mortal combat with the grace of dancers and the intensity of professional killers. Yes, their names were probably staged names. Amazon and Achillea weren't born with those on birth certificates. But neither were the men. Names like Flamma and Crixus were chosen for effect. Because gladiators weren't just warriors. They were celebrities, with fan bases, merchandise, and sponsors. Think UFC meets the Kardashians, but more knives. Female gladiators trained in the same elitist schools as men, brutal, unrelenting institutions where your value was measured in how many people you could beat into the dirt. They practiced with wooden weapons first, graduated to steel, and learned not just how to kill, but how to perform it for the crowd. That's the twisted beauty of it. It wasn't just survival, it was theater. If you died poorly, without drama, you were a disappointment. If you fought with flair, even in death, you might win eternal fame, or at least a decent burial. Now, don't think for a second that gladiatrices wore metal bikinis or stiletto sandals. That's modern fantasy nonsense. Most evidence suggests they wore tunics or loincloths, maybe bare-chested like male fighters, with weapons and small shields. And helmets? Often not. Why? Because Roman audiences wanted to see their faces. The horror. The pain. The gender scandal of it all. Imagine a patrician senator sitting there with his goblet, watching a woman his daughter's age decapitate a Thracian, and thinking, "Ah yes, civilization." So what did society really think? Mixed reviews. On one hand, emperors used them as spectacle, an exotic twist to keep the jaded masses entertained. On the other hand, philosophers and moralists wrote passive-aggressive treatises about the fall of decency. If women are warriors, what next? Children voting? This hypocrisy ran deep. Romans worshipped goddesses like Minerva and Bellona, goddesses of war, mind you, but couldn't handle living women in similar roles. And yet, the gladiatrices kept showing up. Emperor Septimius Severus, in the early 200 CE, finally banned women from fighting in the arena altogether. Why? Officially, because it was unseemly. Unofficially? Because they were getting popular. Too popular. Crowds were cheering. Women were training. Daughters of nobles were eyeing the sword rack. And that, to Roman elites, was a problem. You see, the gladiator wasn't just a fighter, they were a social disruptor. When a woman stepped into the arena, she became more than a curiosity. She became proof that strength wasn't gendered, and in a world where patriarchy was built into architecture, that was revolutionary. But even after Severus's ban, whispers of female gladiators persisted. Illicit fights, private matches at dinner parties, underground training schools. Because the appetite was still there. And where there's demand, there's always supply. We end this first chapter with a familiar Roman pattern: suppress, erase, repeat. By the end of the 3rd century, gladiatrices were officially illegal, historically minimized, and socially erased. But traces remain, in art, in bones, in inscriptions that survived where the written record tried to forget. Because history is petty, but archaeology is patient. Let's begin where most Roman horror stories do, in the ludus, or gladiator training school, an institution so grim it made military camps look like spa retreats. Here, hopeful killers were forged from human desperation, sweat, and the kind of discipline that would make a modern drill sergeant cry. And yes, some of those hopeful killers were women. Female gladiators, or gladiatrices, didn't get a separate pastel pink ludus. They trained with the same wooden swords, ran the same drills, and endured the same bone-breaking routines as the men. And if they didn't, they died faster. That was the only real gender difference in the arena, no margin for error. The lanista, the brutal, profit-obsessed manager of the gladiator school, had one goal: turn human meat into crowd-pleasing killers. If a woman could fight and make money, she was in. If she couldn't, well, there was always room for one more body in the ditch behind the amphitheater. Training was relentless. Wake up before dawn. Run until your lungs gave out. Practice with wooden weapons heavier than steel. Fight in mock battles until someone bled, or passed out, or both. Repeat. Then eat something vaguely resembling food, nurse your bruises, and start over. It was CrossFit meets ancient trauma. And still, women signed up. Why? Because Rome was an empire of limits, and the arena was one of the few places where nobody could become somebody, however briefly. And for women, who were expected to stay silent, obedient, and indoors, the appeal of becoming a name, a legend, even for one bloody season, was irresistible. Now, don't go picturing the Colosseum as an enlightened co-ed experience. Roman society still hated the idea of women fighting, even as they secretly loved watching it. It's the same contradiction we see today with scandalized headlines followed by record-breaking ratings. What's interesting is that female gladiators weren't always ridiculed, some were genuinely admired. They were seen as exotic, daring, and strangely glamorous in a terrifying, stabby way. They weren't allowed to fight in the biggest official matches, but they were paraded in private shows, surprise spectacles, and late-night novelty bouts designed to titillate and terrify. The elite, of course, were horrified. Senators clutched their togas, muttering things like, "What's next? Female philosophers?" Spoiler, that already happened, too. Philosophers like Seneca tooted about moral decline. Pliny the Elder was too busy cataloging poisonous snakes to weigh in, but one imagines he would have written something judgy. Meanwhile, the emperors? They had no such shame. Nero reportedly made elite women perform on stage and in arenas as part of his ongoing campaign to transform Rome into a violent soap opera. And Domitian, as we mentioned, held torchlit nighttime matches with women and dwarves in the Flavian amphitheater, which sounds like the beginning of a very weird fan fiction. But perhaps the strangest thing about female gladiators is how hard Rome tried to erase them after the fact. By the 3rd century, they were banned. Gone from official records. Airbrushed from history like an inconvenient ant. But archaeology, as usual, wasn't having it. In 200 CE, a small marble relief was found in Halicarnassus, modern-day Turkey, depicting 2 women in gladiator kit. Their names? Amazon and Achillea, stage names, yes, but carved in stone. The 2 are shown in active combat, muscular and fierce, clearly intended to impress. The caption reads that they were both released after fighting, ad gladium, meaning they fought to the point of surrender, not death. This tiny fragment of art, probably mounted on a wall for decades, tells us volumes that Roman historians refused to write. And then there are the skeletons. One particularly infamous grave discovered in London's Southwark district contained the remains of a woman buried with expensive grave goods, incense from across the empire, and scorched animal bones, indicative of arena funerals. Scientists initially shrugged it off. Surely this must be a performer, or a courtesan, or a priestess of something weird. Anything but a fighter. Why the denial? Because women in ancient Rome weren't supposed to be physically powerful, or publicly aggressive, or visible. A gladiatrix, by definition, violated all of that. So instead of confronting the evidence, historians did what Rome did best: looked away and pretended it wasn't happening. Let's return briefly to the idea of volunteer gladiatrices, because that's where things get even messier. Some upper-class women, yes, aristocrats with names, dowries, and ancestral portraits, apparently chose to enter the arena. This was considered the social equivalent of stripping naked and running through the Senate with a burning chicken. It was shocking, appalling, and sometimes exactly what they wanted. Roman women weren't supposed to seek glory. They were supposed to support their husband's glory, quietly, from behind a silk curtain. But some women had other plans. Whether they were rebelling, seeking fame, or just bored out of their minds, they signed up. And the city gossiped like wildfire. These women were publicly shamed. Scrolls were written. Poets composed nasty verses. And yet it didn't stop. Because even with the humiliation, it was freedom to act, to exist, to fight on their own terms. And let's talk about weapons, because of course we're going there. Female gladiators used the same arsenal as their male counterparts: gladius, short sword, sicca, curved dagger, trident, net, scutum, big shield, or parma, small shield. Their style varied based on their assigned role: murmillo, retiarius, thraex. But make no mistake, they trained in real techniques, not pantomime. Contrary to Hollywood, they didn't duel in slow motion or deliver monologues mid-fight. Combat was fast, brutal, sweaty, and usually decided within minutes. Either your opponent surrendered, or bled out, or both. Some matches ended in ties if the crowd was impressed. Some ended in death if the emperor was bored. And yes, the crowd could decide your fate. Gladiators fought under the eyes of tens of thousands, sometimes cheering, sometimes jeering. If a gladiatrix lost but fought well, the crowd might demand mercy. If she stumbled or didn't entertain, thumbs went sideways or down. And down didn't mean you got a stern talking to. It meant someone caved in your skull with a hammer. This blend of sport, spectacle, and state-sanctioned murder was the Roman idea of civic bonding. Bread in circuses. Blood and cheers. But here's the twist: some female gladiators became celebrities. Their names were chanted. Their graffiti scribbled on tavern walls. Their likenesses painted in houses. And while the historical record is thin, it's clear from the little we have that some women achieved genuine fame in the arena. Which made them even more dangerous. Because a famous woman with a weapon is a threat to the social order. Not just because she kills, but because she inspires. To fight was to be free. To win was to be seen. And for a woman in Rome, where the law classified her as basically a piece of her father's furniture, that was revolutionary. By the time the 3rd century rolled around, Rome had reached a peculiar kind of crisis. It wasn't just the usual plagues, invasions, or bankrupt emperors buying loyalty with coins made of wishful thinking. No, this crisis was cultural. Because somewhere between the golden statues and the sewer fires, Roman society had realized a terrible truth. Women were getting too interesting. And nowhere was this more unsettling than in the arena. You see, while male gladiators were dangerous in the flesh, they were safe in theory. They had rules. You could admire them without questioning your dinner party seating chart. But female gladiators? They made things messy. They weren't just blood sport. They were political commentary, wrapped in muscles and smeared in sand. Enter Emperor Septimius Severus. Known for being stern, efficient, and about as fun at parties as a barrel of vinegar, Severus ruled during a time of increasing chaos. In 200 CE, he looked around at the empire, the unstable borders, the crumbling moral authority, the women stabbing each other for applause, and decided, enough was enough. So he did what emperors do best when they're uncomfortable. He banned things. Specifically, he banned women from appearing in the arena. The official reason? It was unseemly, which, in Roman terms, is code for the crowds were cheering too loudly for the wrong gender. The real reason? Probably a mix of moral panic, social pressure, and the growing unease that the empire's masculine image was starting to develop in convenient curves. This wasn't just about bloodshed. It was about control. Because female gladiators were more than fighters. They were visual heresies. They stood in public, armed, applauded, unmarried, and unashamed. They were everything Roman patriarchs feared their daughters might become if they spent too much time out of the atrium. So the ban passed. Just like that, an entire type of person was made illegal. And what happened next is familiar to anyone who's watched power get nervous. History moved in. Not to preserve, but to erase. Public records stopped mentioning female gladiators. Statues were melted down or mislabeled. Graffiti faded. Stories were rewritten. If a gladiatrix had lived, bled, and died in front of thousands, well, that must have been a dream. Or a metaphor. Or a scandal best not repeated. Rome, like every great empire, had perfected the art of historical amnesia. But the problem with trying to erase people is that bones don't listen. Remember that grave in Southwark, London? Or the relief from Halicarnassus? They weren't supposed to survive. But they did. And archaeologists, those professional troublemakers of history, started connecting the dots. Women with injuries matching combat. Burials that mimic gladiator rites. Trinkets and charms linked to arena superstitions. The evidence whispered through time, we were here, we fought, and we mattered. And yet, no biographies. No scrolls. No epic poems. Male gladiators got fan clubs. Female ones got buried twice, once in the ground, and once by historians with priorities. This silence tells us something crucial. Rome didn't just fear female violence, it feared female agency. A gladiatrix was a woman who didn't marry, didn't cook, didn't make babies on schedule. She made decisions. She made eye contact. She made the crowd scream. And worst of all, she made a living on her own terms. That was the true obscenity. It wasn't the sword. It was the freedom. Let's dig a little deeper into the why. Why did people really find female gladiators so offensive? Because they were impossible to categorize. Roman women were supposed to fit into 3 boxes: virgin, wife, or widow. The gladiatrix kicked all 3 over and set them on fire. She wasn't just a rule breaker. She was a rule refuser. The law said she was property. She became a performer. Religion said she was sacred. She made herself a spectacle. Philosophy said she was passive. She parried and lunged until someone stopped breathing. And in a society where every layer of identity, legal, sexual, spiritual, depended on hierarchy, this kind of defiance was a threat to the empire's foundation. But here's the twist: banning female gladiators didn't work. Private shows continued. Wealthy elites, hungry for scandal, hosted underground matches. Gladiatrices reappeared in provincial cities far from Rome's moral gaze. Local governors quietly looked the other way, especially if the tickets sold. Because you can't ban appetite. And Romans had an appetite for contradiction. They praised virtue, then bought tickets to vice. They built temples to modesty, then hired women to duel in their courtyards. And so, the gladiatrix became a ghost, half myth, half rumor, half-time entertainment. We know she existed. We know she bled. We know the crowd screamed. But after the bans, the traces get thin. Names are missing. Numbers vanish. The arena shifts back to its familiar male-centered chaos. And the female fighters fade, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Too many cheers. Too many questions. Too much disruption. Rome didn't just erase them. It needed to. Because if they stayed in memory, someone might start to believe that gender was negotiable. That roles weren't fixed. That a girl with a dagger could be more than an accident of scandal, she could be a hero. And if that happened, well, what next? Voting? Literacy? Equal funeral rights? Better to stamp it out. Safer to forget. By the time the Western Roman Empire finally did its dramatic death spiral in 476 CE, choking on its own corruption, overspending, and barbarian houseguests, female gladiators were already ghosts. Officially erased, socially taboo, and historically downgraded to possible hallucination, they lingered in the corners of forgotten mosaics and suspiciously muscular statues. But what Rome forgot, others remembered, in their own twisted ways. Because the gladiatrix didn't just vanish. She mutated. In medieval Europe, where everyone was pretending not to be fascinated by pagan blood rituals, women fighters still popped up, mostly in poems, miracle plays, and fever dreams. The church was deeply allergic to the idea, of course. A woman with a sword? That smelled of Satan, heresy, or worse, self-confidence. But the myth wouldn't die. In paintings and tapestries, women began appearing in battle scenes, not always as saints, but sometimes as armored soldiers, war goddesses, or supernatural warriors. The medieval mind, starved for color and terrified of nudity, still found a way to keep the idea alive. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the gladiatrix reemerges like a scandalous rumor at a dinner party. Artists rediscovered Rome's juiciest bits, and surprise, female gladiators were suddenly back on the canvas. Painted, sculpted, and dressed in wildly inaccurate armor, they appeared in noble homes, decorative reminders that history was always more complicated than the schoolbooks said. Of course, by now they were stylized to the point of fiction. Perfect hair. Perfect posture. Swords that looked like they'd never seen blood. But under the gloss, the symbol remained. A woman who fought. Let's be honest, she made people nervous even in oil paint. Because the female gladiator isn't just a curiosity. She's a rebuttal. To every law that said no. To every philosopher who wrote her out of relevance. To every dusty historian who insisted Rome was too civilized for such things. She's a living contradiction, a killer and a spectacle, a woman and a weapon. And if you think she stayed in the past, think again. Let's look at her legacy, the strange and wonderful places her shadow turned up. In 18th century Europe, traveling circuses often featured women dueling with swords, sometimes in mock Roman outfits. Were they historical reenactments? Of course not. Were they respectful? Don't bet on it. But were they tapping into a deep, unspoken cultural fascination with women warriors? Absolutely. In the 19th century, as archaeology exploded and dusty empires started digging up their own skeletons, more evidence began to surface. Graves, statues, and long-lost scrolls. The academic world, caught between Victorian prudery and scholarly excitement, didn't know what to do with them. Some scholars tried to explain it all away. Clearly ceremonial, they said. Symbolic, they muttered. One can almost hear them choking on their monocles. But others began to take it seriously. Quietly at first. Then louder. By the 20th century, feminist historians had picked up the trail and started shouting the obvious. Female gladiators existed, and Rome deliberately erased them. And in that rediscovery, the gladiatrix was reborn, this time, as cultural icon. She showed up in fiction, in film, in comics. Sometimes absurd, sometimes powerful, sometimes both. Hollywood mostly went with the leather bikini approach, but even that misstep spoke volumes. Because once an idea re-enters the public imagination, it's hard to control, even with bad costume design. But beyond the swords and sandals, the core idea remains electrifying. A woman, not defined by marriage or motherhood, standing in front of thousands, armed and unafraid. It's an image that still stings the comfort zones of power. Because even now, the story of female gladiators makes people squirm, not because they were violent, but because they were visible, public, celebrated, dangerous. The kind of women who refuse to die quietly in history's footnotes. And that partial erasure? That's the final twist. Because it turns out, being forgotten isn't failure. It's threat management. History tends to bury what it finds inconvenient. Which means anything deliberately forgotten is probably worth remembering twice as hard. So what do we do with this knowledge? We resurrect them. We speak their names, if we can find them. We carve space for their stories, even when records fail us. We look at the reliefs, the bones, the rumors, and we say, you were real. You mattered. You made the arena tremble. Because to be forgotten is the cruelest fate for a gladiator. Not death, not pain, not even defeat. But silence. And yet, even now, the gladiatrix refuses to be silent. She rises from stone and sand. She flickers in art. She charges through fiction. She lives, not because Rome wanted her to, but because she refused to leave. So here's to the women who fought, bled, and laughed in the face of empire. They didn't just survive the arena. They outlived it.